fourth session in the WOMM Community Strategist Training Program. We'll wait just a minute or two to give everyone a chance to dial in. I can see folks are still actively dialing in. All right, as folks are continuing to dial in, I think I'm going to get started so we can get through the housekeeping and get started. I want to give as much time as possible to Frank because I know he's got a lot of great stuff for us. So my name is Jim Storer, and I'm the co-founder of the Community Roundtable, and I'll be the moderator for the class today. I'm pleased to have Frank Eliason here from Citibank to talk with us. Hi, Frank.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, we're excited. Let me get through a few housekeeping notes and we'll get you started. First of all, feel free to enter questions in the questions tab on the right-hand side. I'll answer some during the session if I can. If I can't, I will hold them for Frank at the end. Please feel free to share and follow the conversation on Twitter using the CM Training hashtag. That's CM Training. We'll keep an eye on your tweets and announce a top tweeter at the end of the class. Just a reminder, it's okay if you can't make every session. We will have archives of the sessions that we'll send to you via email. We realize that this recording from session 3 has not been sent out yet, but we're working on that, and it should be out soon after this course is done today. There's also a private Facebook group. If you haven't joined it yet, please do. That's where we post additional questions, the recordings, the PDFs, and there's a lot of great conversations going on there. So Megan will share the link to that in the chat during the call today, and click on it and ask to join. Now on to today's session. It's called Social Customer Support, and it's presented by Frank Eliason. Frank is at Frank Eliason on Twitter. He is the SVP of social media for Citibank in New York. Most people have heard about Frank through his work at Comcast and at Comcast Cares. He is also the author of At Your Service, and we'll link that up in the chat as well. It's a best-selling book about attracting new customers, increasing sales, and growing your business using simple customer service techniques. Besides helping others, Frank's interests are sports, especially football. He's also a gadget geek. We've established that he loves Apple products. He loves electronics in general. He also serves on the board of directors for both the Council of Better Business Bureaus and the Society of Consumer Affairs Professionals. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Frank to begin the session.
Well, thank you for having me. Let's have a little bit of fun here today. I look forward to your tweets. If we don't get through everything, the thing to know about me, if we've not had the chance to interact, you can ask me questions anytime. I'm always happy to get involved in the conversation. I tell it like I see it. Sometimes there's things you'll agree with me. There's sometimes you won't agree with me, and that's certainly fine. This is still, even though social media has been around for a little while, it's still relatively new in the overall scheme of things, and there's still things we're learning each and every day. And as part of the presentation today, I'm going to take you down the trip of memory lane a little bit and go over some things from the days where, we started doing some of these things when I was at Comcast. So we'll go through a little bit of that. But the key is have fun. I think, and ask anything you want. So let's get started. Here's the agenda. For those that know me, I usually don't follow an agenda very well, but for purposes of this, I'm going to try and do my best to make sure that I do follow the agenda as closely as I can. But I want to give you some new things as well as a look at some other things. So my goal is to get you thinking, and I think the more we're thinking, the better we all are. So give you that to take a quick glance at, but let's get really into it. You already heard about me, and actually my title just changed this week. So I'm now Director of Citi Global Consumer Social Media. Before I used to handle just North America. So the big change there. Everything else is stuff that you saw, although my email address, if you want to ask questions privately, feel free to do that. Also, I actually learned something here. I follow everybody that follows me. The reason I do that is it allows people to private message. That became important while in my Comcast days. If you're dealing with consumers, they don't always want to blast your brand in social media, but sometimes they want to go to someone they trust. And in social media, they do build trust with individuals, and we're going to talk about that because it's something that's been on my mind a lot lately. So I made sure to add it into this deck. But let's take a look at what happened, over time. Back in the day, and so back in the day when I say that, I'm talking 2006, 2007, 2008, when I certainly started in social media, and a number of us did. We didn't start because our brand was loved, and I'm thinking of brands such as Dell or Comcast. That's not why we were there. We were out in social media because we were a part of brands in trouble. Dell certainly came out because of Dell Hell by Jeff Jarvis, who actually was kind enough to write one of the two forwards in the book. The other forward was actually Brian Solis. Jeff Jarvis and certainly what the community felt about Dell and their customer service back then. And then Comcast, we all love the cable company. The fact is we're very passionate about cable, especially TV and internet. They connect us to the world. Yet we don't necessarily feel that the cable company has that same passion for us. They raise our rates. You call and get help, and you get the runaround. So that needed to change. Where did that change come from? There was a little video that you can see a picture of on the lower right-hand side of Sleepy Technician. But you also have Bob Garfield creating Comcast Must Die. The Consumer is one of my favorite websites to go to as a service guy. I visit it all the time. But they really have made it part of their mission to get brands to really, change the way they treat their own customers. So we have a lot going on back then. But guess what, guys? Back then it was onesie, twosie, not that big of a deal. But you know what? We're in for a wild ride because things are really heating up, and they're heating up not where brands are usually in love, although there's a couple examples here of that, and I'll talk through that. But what's really been going on is consumers have realized they control the brand in social media. It is their brand to do what they wish with. And we've watched a number of incidences recently. So you had the Dell in 2006, you had Comcast in 2007, onesie twosies happening. But then in just a one-week period, we had a ton of issues go on, such as, we had Progressive Insurance and, a lawsuit that they were involved with where they were defending the person who killed someone in an accident and killed the insured. Now, that may not be fully the case, and there's deeper story to that, but that's not the story social media got. The story social media got is that they were doing this, and it went viral. You have Target in Australia, who basically got destroyed. Had a post go viral on Facebook that was about their clothes and being, actually I'll just say what it says, hooker style, quote unquote. And Target, typically a well-loved brand, so it's kind of interesting to watch that happen. So it's not even the brands that are hated anymore that this is happening to. We had insurance. They had a gentleman who had their insurance. He had cancer, and he was a student. Because of the cancer, he reached the $3 million cap that the policy he had had as part of it, so they weren't covering anything anymore. He got in conversation with their CEO on Twitter, because the Aetna CEO is actually on Twitter. Well, at the end of the day, what wound up happening, they wound up, providing, removing that cap for that individual. Not sure those decisions, like the Progressive example, they wound up settling that lawsuit the same day or the next day as that happened. I don't necessarily know that type of message which you really want to fully send out there, because now what are you telling your consumers? You're not going to get to what you want through the normal channels, but you go through these other channels, now you'll get what you want. It's going to cause people to really start destroying brands in social media. We're seeing it. So these examples all happened within a week or two period. Now, there have been some good examples and some examples that I really loved. There's an example, Panera Bread. Panera Bread, you can read the post that's on the screen, but basically, there's a woman who was dying, and their family said, you know what, she's in the hospital, but she really loved your clam chowder, and I know you only make clam chowder on Friday, but it's really important. Can you make it? And the store said, yeah, we'll do it for you. We'll make that exception. The woman, to thank them for doing that, went to Facebook and posted on their wall this thank you message. The post went viral. So not a post by the company, a post by the customer. customer experience really plays into, how people are going to feel about your brand. I know I personally love Panera, and, that post went viral, and I know I liked it, and a lot of others did as well. Another example is Publix, which is a supermarket chain. There's a story of, a manager playing with a kid, and, or helping settle a kid who was, frustrated in the while shopping. And the mother was so pleased that the manager did that she posted on the wall. The post went viral. These are the themes that play out. Good stuff or really bad stuff, one or the other, but that's what's really taking over in social media. But I want to take you back a bit, because I've been watching brands and social media for a long time. I was one of the first ones out on Twitter. I started on Twitter from a brand perspective back in April 2008. Back then, there was only a handful of brands that were out there. I actually pictured some of them here. And it's really important for me to get you to think about this, because over the years people have tried to do and replicate what these companies have done, and over time, and really start to do things a bit differently. And so they started to try and replicate what Starbucks did, and Zappos, etc. There's more to the story than being out in Starbucks and giving out muffins. There's a much bigger part of that story. I'll use Starbucks as the example, but I can go into the example for each of these. Every one of these, what the deal was is we knew the people behind the brand. I can't emphasize this enough. It was knowing the people behind the brand, the humanizing aspect. Starbucks, we knew, was Brad Nelson. We knew who it was. And it's really funny, when he would go on vacation, they would actually have to tell people Brad is on vacation. Why? Because the reason people were paying attention was not because it was Starbucks, although that was a key that may have brought them in. They loved the account because it was Brad Nelson. Zappos, obviously we all know Tony Hsieh. Dell has a lot of Twitter accounts, but it still came down to people like Richard Adele and the people that are really a big part of that brand. We knew a lot of people that were part of that brand, and they were very helpful to other companies as they were going into this place. We knew the people. So I want you to always think about that when you look at, when you're considering what companies do well and or not in social media. The humanizing aspect is something that's often missed, and it's often missed not because of people like you or I who are in this space and feel it. It's missed because legal's worried about someone that, or I'm probably the biggest guilty offender of it all. What did I do? I certainly worked with Comcast, and then I left. I'm sure people said, see, that's why you don't do this. But you know what? Charlene Lee did a video after I left, and she said, you know what? Isn't it great that Comcast had that time with Frank? And that's what should be celebrated. And what I'll do is, if you ever wonder, what companies should do and how they should handle that, Comcast handled my departure beautifully, and there's a lot of examples of that, including videos that they did. So highly recommend checking those out. So obviously brands are trying to win. They're trying to win in all these different places, and what's the right thing? How do you make these choices? What do you do in each of these ways? This is what brands are thinking about. And these are the social media sites that they really concentrate on. It kind of bugs me when I hear that, or I was just at a conference, and it was a conference where we were speaking about fraud and banking and stuff like that, and there's people within it that said social media policies, you should never say what company you work for. And so I obviously turned to them and said, how many of you are on LinkedIn? Which basically almost the whole room said yes. So, well, okay, then you're all violating that one tenet that you just all agreed is such an important thing to do. Sorry, it doesn't work. So you have to have this dialogue. You have to have this conversation. I understood where they were coming from and why they said it, but then they have to understand that there's other sides to that. And there's brand benefits to certainly having those things. But social media is more than just those. It's so many other things. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's all about people. It's social. Here's some of the people from, that you saw, different people from, there's Brad in the upper right-hand corner. You see on the right-hand, in the middle, you see Tony Shea from Zappos. Zappos used to celebrate all their employees in social media and used to put them all on their website. They don't do that anymore. I kind of miss those days because I thought it was so cool that they did that. But always concentrate the people, the people, the people. You win with your employees, and you win not just in the Facebook or the Twitters of the world, but you win throughout the social web because it is everywhere, and it is a big, big dialogue. But now let's get into some of the things I want to talk about, because most people who know me really know, hey, I'm the service guy. My background is purely in customer service. Today I sit in marketing, but I always see myself as a service guy. And it gives me a different perspective sometimes in social media. I'll tell you, I think most companies, as a general rule of thumb, are a complete failure when it comes to social media customer service. Not meaning that they don't do it. A lot of companies do it. The problem to what they're doing in social media is they're trying to shut someone up who's being loud about the brand, but they're not fixing the core issues as to what's wrong. It's a huge, huge mistake, and they have to stop doing these things. They have to concentrate on fixing the problems. And, otherwise, they're just going to tell more people to go to social. I'm not going to get fully into that. You can certainly, Google some of my thoughts on that. I talk a lot about that in my book. Or there's blog posts out there where I call social media customer service a failure, and you can read the reasons why. But there's other things that I believe are going on in social. I think we just went through a stage where it was all about marketing and pushing a message out or trying to win some buzz. And if you did something new, unique, different, it took off and went viral. It's not that easy anymore. I think we went through that stage, and the stage that we're currently in, and you're hearing a lot of more buzz around, it's all about content, content, content. I'm a huge believer in content, so don't think that I don't think content's important. I think it's extraordinarily important. It allows you to own SEO, allows you to certainly have a say in some of the discussion that's going on. But I think the content phase, if every company is putting out tons and tons of content, it's just going to get diluted because people don't have time to go through all that stuff, nor do they want to go through all that stuff. So content from your own customer base or employees, that might be more powerful. And that takes me to where I think we're really headed, which is more about the people. And so you're not going to hear me sit and say social business is where we're going or any of those other things. I'm going to just say it's going to be more about the people. And I think we're getting at this early parts of those stages, so we're in the content phase, but people are starting to understand that that's where we're headed. And I see this possibility of scalable intimacy that I think is very interesting. You have scalable intimacy in the ways I described about the brands. Who are your employees? How they represent you regarding the brand? How do they treat people? And I think those things are certainly quite interesting. And I think that's something from a brand perspective that's going to be extraordinarily important. So employees representing the brand, very important. But I also think that there's this interesting possibility that all of a sudden we have the ability to know our customer for what they want the world to know. And what's really interesting here is today most companies are listening in social media. They're listening just for brand mentions. They're looking for that next crisis. They're looking for that positive stuff, but they're really looking at brand mentions. And I think there's a greater power here. There's a power to actually know the customer for what they want the world to know. They're telling it. They're sharing it. And start listening in a little deeper sense. And I don't think we always listen that well. And I'll give you actually a real quick example of that. There's not that long ago, there's an incident where a younger person did a blog post that said, every social media manager should be under the age of 25, 24, I forget what the age it was. And people in the business took great offense to it. And I even Twittered out and said, I disagree, and here's the link. But after I did that tweet, I went, wait a second, let me sit back here. What is she trying to say? am I really listening to her? So I started reading not only that post, I started reading her other posts that she's done over time for the same organization. And they actually all had a theme. Their theme was, we're young people, we just graduated from college, and we can't get a job. And then when you add in this social media post, she was basically saying, wait a second, here's something we've got to qualify for because we don't qualify for anything else, it seems. And, that frustration. Well, you know what? I think having a dialogue about jobs is extraordinarily important. I think social brings this capability that we can all get together and find solutions to these problems if we put our minds to it. And so, where we made it personal with that individual and offended by what she said, we should have actually listened to what she was really saying through these other things and maybe brought that to a more constructive dialogue, which is, what can we do to create jobs? What can we do to help this group of people that just spent a lot of money going to college and can't find a job? How do we help them? How do we help the millions of people who are out of work right now find the right employment for them? That's a better, more powerful social way of doing things. And we have to get better at that, and I think we will. Well, the problem that most companies have, first of all, I'm not always a huge fan of social media policies for a few different reasons. First of all, usually the stuff in a social media policy is already addressed through other policies. I also hate the fact that the policy is, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. We tend to do that often, as opposed to, let me help you do what you can do and how you can have guidelines that actually work. And the other thing we avoid is we don't teach people how to use social media. We just tell them all the things they can't do. Well, someone who's not in social media, what are we going to do? We're scaring them off. They're not even going to want to get in social media after you say some of this stuff. And that's not what we should be doing. We should be trying to teach them how to use social media, why it's good for them as an individual, what are ways that they can use it. What are the different spaces and how are they used? So, we have to get better at that as an organization, especially the larger companies. I work in the banking business. Our policies are highly restrictive. Now, some of those restrictions are due to regulations, et cetera, laws, and are important. And I don't want to diminish their importance. But first of all, those laws and those regulations are addressed in other pieces of policy. The other knock I'll give to bankers is, or not just bankers, but people in these industries, these highly regulated industries. The answer typically is, you can't do that, you can't do this, you can't do this, as opposed to, why don't you partner with regulators? Because guess what? They're confused at how the laws and the regulations apply to what is happening out there. And so I would encourage, always think about that, in your career. What are ways and how can you really bring about some of these different dialogues? How can you be the facilitator of these dialogues? Because I'm friends with a lot of regulators, and they're confused by a lot of the laws too, because the laws were written so long ago and how they apply today. What is the way that works? They're not really quite certain. But have that dialogue because you can come to the solution together. One of the other best practices in guidelines, obviously you can't release information that's not publicly available. I think most employees understand those things. But you also have to get into being nice and respecting others and honesty. These are things that should be in everything that you do as it is. Unfortunately, most companies like to say that they're employee-centered or customer-centered, yet in reality they're not usually in either of those. So, they need to understand this. But they need to understand it not just in social media, but everything else. This is how these things flow. Social media is not that different. It's a form of means of communicating. And, it can be very powerful for companies, especially as their employees really help them spread the word of their brand. So I hope we see a lot of that. But I want to hit home. You're hearing a lot of things from me about this humanizing aspect of social media. And, for those that have known me, they know Comcast, for the most part, most of the time I was there, all their individuals, all the people that work there had their own Twitter IDs, and they still do to this day. That's not a change. And I had my own Twitter ID, which was the Comcast Cares ID, which I did leave with Comcast when I left, but they were the ones, but it was my ID up until that point. But the reason why it was my idea and individualized ID came down to a day off. So I started in social media in 2008 in April, and we started well before that, but we, in Twitter, really didn't tweet until April of 2008. And when I finally did tweet, what happened was really suddenly we received a lot of press. It was kind of surprising to me. And it actually made me nervous. So I was in the process of hiring people to be on my team, and all of a sudden we got all this press. In fact, I got quoted a few times where I didn't even speak to a reporter. They took tweets. And it caused me to get really scared of the space a little bit. And I didn't want to throw someone new out there. So I was the only one that was there for probably April, I think, until around September, October is when I finally got someone else to help me out. And I was working 7 days a week. I was actually out there every single day. Most days I was out there from 6 in the morning until about 2 in the morning. And so in July, I said, you know what, guys, I need to take a day off. I'm not going to be out here tomorrow on Saturday. And it was July 26th. I didn't get into why. I just said, guys, I apologize. I'm not going to be out here tomorrow. I'll be back on Sunday. And, that day, there's a few things. That day, we were celebrating our daughter's birthday. It was her second birthday party. It was the only day we can have a birthday party, and it was the only day that would work in our schedules. But the day actually had another piece of relevance. It was actually the anniversary of our daughter's death, and she's pictured there, Gianna. And so Gia passed away that day, and people found this out because I had a family website, which is actually still out there, and they found that and realized what the day was. And so throughout the day, we had people that were going through the same search I would and say, let's let Frank have his day. Can I help you? And they were doing it throughout the day. In fact, many of them came from the Maryland region, and one of these days I'll figure out precisely who they were, because I really want to personally and publicly thank them, because it was probably the most powerful feeling that I've ever had in my life to, at the end of the day, at the end of that party, sitting there with some friends, I was having a few beers, and actually looking through that search and having them helping people, not because of Comcast, but they were doing it for me. They didn't even work for Comcast. That is the power of, being a part of the community and being, that humanized aspect to things that companies are missing the boat on, completely just missing it. And I understand the challenges to it, and I think a lot of it is the learning phase for companies. And I think as we get to the more of the people phase, that's going to be a big issue. So anyway, that's enough on that stuff. That's the deep stuff. Now let's get into where we're going, what's going on, and some examples of how this all flows, because this is really about learning from examples, and I have some of that for you. But I want to talk about first is I mentioned scalable intimacy, and I want to kind of get back to that a little bit. CRM, and many of you that are in social media heard the term social CRM. You hear it all the time. You hear it for every single tool that's out there. And here's the definitions that are out there. I present the Wikipedia definition as well as Paul Greenberg. If you don't know Paul Greenberg, great guy when it comes to CRM. Wrote the book on it, literally. His book is phenomenal on it. But here's his definition of CRM. But I want to take you to a different aspect of CRM, because unfortunately what I've seen with CRM is it now defines pretty much every tool that is out there for social media. So if you have a listening tool, it's a social CRM tool. If you have a tool to manage your engagement on Facebook, it's a social CRM tool. But let's really look at the original tools of CRM were really based upon a certain premise. The premise was, usually used by outside salespeople. So let's use a pharmaceutical salesperson as an example. They would go to a doctor's office, and they would meet the nurse, they would talk to them, and they would get to the doctor, and eventually maybe even get an order, et cetera. As they're doing this, one of the things they did was they would take notes. Oh, this nurse, here's things she likes, here's things she doesn't like, so don't do these things. When you see this doctor, here's the things you do here. And they were taking these notes, this intimate way of doing things and understanding and what's important to those individuals. And those notes weren't just based upon the buying of pharmaceuticals, but they were based upon the personal interactions as well. And so that's really where CRM came from. And where I see social playing into this role is we now actually have the ability to take that same exact model and actually truly scale it. And that's what I mean. One of the things I mean by scalable intimacy. we now have the ability to take this information and this that people are putting out there all the time and use it in new ways. So, where people look at this social data and go, oh, I can better target them with advertising. I don't necessarily know that really works. I don't think, sometimes they'll turn off ads. It's not what they may be intended for. It may work for some, maybe not others. But the way I see it is, now all of a sudden you can do some more powerful things. Now I can take this information and now I can make sure the next piece of marketing literature I send to you actually has pictures and information that I know is important to you personally. So the picture on it might be a picture that's not about the brand at all. It might have nothing to do with the brand image, but it's about what's important to you as the customer's image. What is important in your head. Why? Because in social we can understand these things. But I actually see it applying also to things like service. Imagine a day where your call can be routed not to the, because you have such a great cloud score and we need to treat you better. I disagree with doing that. But having your call routed to someone who has similar interests to you. Why? We know that people with, when you're serviced, and think of yourself, when you went to that restaurant and you said, wow, that was a great experience. What was the great experience? Most of the time, it's not because they were efficient. It might be good food. It was good product experience. A lot of times, though, it's that where the waiter was sitting there playing with your kids or connected in a different way, and that personal connection is really what became important. Think about when you call a service place and you get a personal conversation with the rep, and it's a really good conversation, you really enjoyed them. What happens then? How do you feel when you got off the phone? Compared to that efficient call where they got you off the phone real quick, fixed whatever it is, usually most of those times you don't even remember them. So you want to create these memorable experiences to win in social media. It's connecting the offline and online worlds. To hit that home, I'll tell you a quick story of David Alston. If you don't know David Alston, he was the CMO of Radian6, which was bought by Salesforce. And actually, I'm forgetting at this point, he has a really cool new title, and I forget it off the top of my head. But he has a really cool new title with Salesforce. Chief Advocate Officer or something along those lines. But I really loved it. So anyway, we met in social media. We met years ago before I even knew what a social listening tool was. And David was great. He never sat there and said, oh, you have to buy Radian6. He never did any of that. But what he did do is he would get involved in these conversations with me in social media about where social media is headed, about CRM, all kinds of topics that were important to me, customer service, because he kind of could see what was important to me. He could follow me on Twitter. It was easier back then when it was so small. And, got to really intimately know it. And, so over time, we wound up building a great relationship together. So what happens? All of a sudden, you need a social listening tool. The time we needed it, Radian6 was not a big company. In fact, they were not big at all. I think they had one major client at the time, a few smaller clients, but they were still really a startup. There was other bigger fish out there at that moment. Leading players that are still leading in some ways in visible technology and a few others. And so I looked at a whole bunch of listening tools, about 10 of them, narrowed it down to 3. And the 3, similar costs, similar aspects, similar features. Why did I choose Radian6? I trusted Radian6. Why? I trusted David. I knew if I had a problem, I can go to David. And, that trust thing is an important aspect, and it's something that is easily scalable and something that happened then. We can do so much better than we do today. So this really brings that, scalable intimacy a little deeper for you in one slide. It's listening to the needs of your customers and employees. It's creating a culture of trust within the organization, which many, especially larger organizations, don't really have. And this is one of the reasons why I think small and mid-sized companies are going to do much better in the foreseeable future, because they can do these things and do them well. But you have to define how you're going to use social data. Tell your customers this, how you'll not use it. I'm waiting for someone to start using social data to say underwrite a loan. It would be the biggest mistake in the world. My view is there's things you can use it for, but there's things you cannot use it for. And be clear about that. and do it in a transparent way. Don't try and hide it, and do it in a way that customers understand it and are accepting of it. If they're not accepting of it, you're probably doing the wrong things. I actually think this is interesting. If you're in a business, like I'm in banking business, I take a very firm stand that data shouldn't be used in certain ways, social data, such as I mentioned, underwriting a loan. I think businesses and the people within them need to take a stand on those certain things like that. They need to say, you know what, that is not an acceptable way to do it. This is. And I think there's going to be a lot of debate over that, and I think there's going to be a lot of discussion over that. But I think it's important for companies to really put that line in the sand. Then you have to, companies keep looking at their business within their own little silos, and they look at within their, the piece that they're looking at. One of the things that frustrates me when I think customer service is and listening, and PR does a lot of listening for brands, but what do they listen for? They're listening for that crisis, and they're not getting this great listening information to everyone in the organization. It's more than just marketing. It's more than just PR. It's more than just service. This is information that's great for everybody, and we have to start thinking that way, and we have to get out of these little mindsets of this little silo and that we work at. Now, when it comes to CRM, I'm not a huge fan of the M piece of that aspect. I don't believe you as the brand manage the relationship. I actually think the customer is the one who manages the relationship. So I've always had an issue with the M. But I do find R to be extraordinarily key. It is about relationships. Relationships is where your real winning aspect is in social media. And, remembering, it's not about, a lot of people want it to be, we should service clout people with higher clout better because they'll spread the word of our brand. I disagree. I can look at, a number of negative examples, including things like a sleepy technician, posted by someone who posted 2 videos ever. I don't think they had clout. Even David Carroll, who I love his video on United Breaks guitar, prior to that video, not have even registered much on cloud. But it was a great video. He did well. So, it's not always about the cloud score, but it is about the relationships and the relationships of the masses. What are the trust that your consumers have in you as a brand? Oftentimes, unfortunately, it's not that good. So, I want to give you 2 examples before we get to questions, and I'll try and make them quick examples. We can get into all kinds of other things, but social media, how do you utilize this information? And my view is it could drive a lot of change. The problem in most business, we've got all about metrics, we've got to measure everything, everything's a process, et cetera, all over the place. And I think the pendulum's gone way too far on that end. And, we've gotten rid of the humanizing aspect in business in many ways. We don't allow people to have the artistic ability to think as much as we should because it doesn't fit the process. But I've been in the customer service business for years, and Comcast wasn't the first company I worked at where I was driving change. I drive change in a lot of places. And, what I always found was, you concentrate on the story. You concentrate on the customer story. If you think the CEO of Comcast wants customers to have a bad experience, you're wrong. Brian doesn't. But that's not what's typically shared upwards. So think inside your organization. What do people share upward in your organization? Usually it's how great they are, right? They don't sit there and say, hey, we suck. They say how great we are. And people from others are saying how bad things are. Oh, that's the lunatic fringe. That's the other thing. That's not the reality. Reality's over here. Well, there is a reality that's out there. And social's highlighting that reality now. And social has these stories. And what I found is if you want to drive change, you take these stories and you can actually, take them right out of social media as they are and share them throughout your organization. And it will drive huge change. At Comcast, we did a daily newsletter to actually share those things and to drive change throughout the organization. Very important thing to do. You want to drive change in your organization? Tell the story. Share the story. It will work. That story is extraordinarily powerful. No senior leader wants to see these bad stories out there and how they impact the brand. And it's usually not what was intended. Once in a while it can be, but most of the time it's not. A lot of times it's pass it down the lane stuff, and then when they find out what happened and the cause of it, they're usually very upset. Now I'll tell you a little bit about, let's take social media a little differently. The banking business has been in crisis for a number of years. And, not only has the banking business been in crisis, but there's been other struggles as well. Obviously there's been business struggles that the banking sectors have, but even more importantly, people have had struggles. And, one of the things I'll challenge the banks on is I think banks could have been much more open and had a much different dialogue. But during the crisis, what did we notice most banks did? They shut up. It's probably the biggest mistake they've made, because a lot of people don't understand a lot of aspects to things. One of the first things I worked on when I joined Citi was looking at people struggling with their mortgage. And not just looking at it, but looking at the entire process, everything about it. And I learned some things that I did not realize going into it. I like to think that going into it, these decisions are, these companies, and we can fix some of these decisions and do it differently, et cetera. Well, guess what? It's not always the companies. I didn't realize that. Most of the mortgages that are held by like a Citi or a Bank of America are actually owned by others. They're owned by people like Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. And those companies that own those things, they actually establish a lot of the rules with it. And I'm not just going to sit here and tell you I think the bankers did all the right things. I don't think that. I think that they did some wrong things. I think there's wrong things done all along the path. And I think, they should have been very different in their approach to this. I think they should have been much more open in their dialogue. And I think if they'd done that, they would have found new things out and would have also built an understanding of, how people felt about them. So I studied a lot of people that were struggling mortgages because as a group, I feel for them on a human side. I want them to be, okay. I wouldn't want to lose my home, and I know that's extraordinarily powerful. So I started listening to the space, not just about Citi's brand, but everybody's struggling with those. And what are some things that we found out? One of my favorite things of finding out was, we knew going into it that people, when they're struggling with mortgage, never called. They tend never to call their mortgage company. Well, why is that? Well, there's a number of reasons for it. One of it's psychological. Do you want to, call your mortgage company and remind them that, I haven't paid my bill? You want them to forget that, don't you? So you tend not to call for those reasons. And then when you talk to social media experts, a lot of things when it comes to this stuff, they say, you should do things on Facebook and Twitter because that's where they are. But let's face facts. People that are struggling with their mortgage aren't usually posting that on Facebook. Why? They don't want their friends and family to know that. Doesn't mean they're not posting online, but they're going to more anonymous places, and they're going to these places where there's not necessarily always the right people to help them. Sometimes there are, sometimes there's not. But they're trying to go to places because they're trying to get help. So we studied the conversation deeply. One of the things we found was that, across the board in the industry, the people you would call for help are called loss mitigation specialists. And we saw tons of conversations about loss mitigation specialists. They're never going to help me. They're there to mitigate loss. You know what? It is a dumb title, isn't it? So, we didn't care what the industry did. We changed, our agents are now called homeowner support specialists, and we made their metrics to be about finding solutions as opposed to collections, which, when that whole situation came out of the collections business. So we had to change the mindset. So we started with our agents. We started first with how they were doing things. But then we studied the conversations that were out there, and we realized some of the places, like a place like loansafe.org, was really good, and they were providing great information to customers and really helping them understand the process. They're helping them understand the different companies that may own a loan and the rules that go along with those, and why they were able to get a modification on this mortgage, but this other mortgage that they have with the same service provider, whether it be Citi or another bank, why wasn't able to get approved there, and understanding that whole process. That site was really good. But then there's other sites that were really poor. They were going to places like the Pissed Consumer and places like that, and they would get people that would chime in and go, hey, send me $1,000 and I'll guarantee you a modification. These are risks that as a bank we have to be concerned about. We have to be, we have to help try to mitigate those. That's where I would like to mitigation would be important. So one of the things we did was we actually created a site to allow people to actually have anonymous conversations where we're even a part of. We do stuff on LoanSafe. We do stuff on some of the better ones. We watch all the other ones. And if we do see something first, we try and guide them to either contacting us or to one of these other sites. So we can start to have this open dialogue. And we created this means to talk about these different aspects of it and getting help and struggling with your mortgage. And being anonymous about it, because we knew that, you know what, we needed to get them in the door, allow them to have a little bit of conversation. Yes, are they going to complain about the city? Yes, absolutely. But you know what, by allowing some of these conversations to happen in this place or on LoanSafe or other places, it allowed at least the start to the dialogue. And then once you start that dialogue, it will open the door to get them to come and have a dialogue with us. And hopefully then at the end of the day, we'll be able to then save their home or find a solution that does work. And it's a very important and very powerful thing to have go on. So that's a little bit about that. We launched the beta of that site this year. I love to see us do more with advertising it, et cetera. But we've done it so far as a slow launch, and I expect to do much more with that. But I thought you'd find that interesting. Social media is not always about Facebook and Twitter. There's other aspects. And then this is the path that we take. It's circular. We're always listening, we're analyzing, we're engaging, we're measuring, we're adapting, and we're listening again. We're keeping it going. Everything starts with listening. Don't jump in this. Too many companies, they jumped into social media just because someone told them they had to be there. You know what? Why'd you have to be there? What did you have to do there? What did your customers want you to do there? Listen, listen, listen. Always start with that. Can't emphasize it enough. It's oversaid, but underdone. And so let's open it up to questions. I apologize. I was a little closer than I thought I was going to be, but about 3 minutes over than I passed. So let's get Jim back on the line, and let's see if he has some questions so far. I normally like to follow the Twitter feed, and I actually didn't today because I'm actually traveling. So hopefully Jim has some good questions for me, and I'll also be asking, going on Twitter at some point and answering back some of them there as well.
There was a pretty good Twitter stream in there, Frank, so thank you so much. I love your passion for this topic. Let me get started. You talked a little bit about the details on how Comcast dealt with your departure. And we had a couple of questions about, should a community manager be the face of the company, and if so, how do you deal with the turnover? So maybe you can go into a little bit more depth on what they did when you left that you think they did really well.
Yeah. Well, and should they, shouldn't they be? I would say, do you trust a logo or do you trust people? I tend to trust people, and oftentimes we don't trust logos. So having the people out there and humanizing the brand can be extraordinarily powerful. And by the way, it's nothing new in business. It's been happening for years. There are individuals there. Just social media allows that to be a much greater, larger aspect. And some will build more trust than others and really have where people love to be a part of that individual or be around that individual, and they'll be disappointed when they leave. Now, how do you deal with that? It's going to vary by person. It's going to vary by how the community feels about it. While I was at Comcast, I ran a number of their service functions, but I also ran a lot of their social media functions, including their forums. And as we had obviously people left. One person left really because I was taking over, and we decided it was time to make some changes in how we did things. And so they weren't too pleased that they were leaving. But they were loved by some of the people in the community, and the community certainly got up in arms in some ways. So we, kind of said, look, let's chat, and we made them a part of that, what was going on, so they could understand the changes we were making as an organization. And certainly was not a negative reflection on that individual, just we were actually elevating where it was going to sit and how we were going to do it, and that individual was certainly welcome to continue to be a part of it. And so we brought them as part of that mix of the changes that were going on. Then after I did take over, I had some people who would leave at times, and I always was very open about them leaving, and let people know that someone was leaving, and I would celebrate them in minor ways. So if it was within our forums, we would talk about, oh, so-and-so is going to be leaving this week. I want to thank them for everything they did. Usually I would send out a personal message towards it. If it were on Twitter, one of the interesting things you'll find, Now, the way my departure, I gave the Comcast Cares logo to Comcast. That being said, during my time there, others who departed, I allowed them to change the user ID from whatever they had to whatever they wanted to, and actually go with the ID. So, and that may surprise a few people on that. But to me is, we need to be honest about what's going on. Obviously they're going to see these changes going on. Let's be honest about it. Let's not try and hide it. And so, let's allow the community that, those followers who are the community, let them decide, do they want to follow or don't they? Let's not try and force them to follow something different. So I think that those decisions are going to be a little bit more trickier in situations for companies, but for the most part worked out really well, including people who maybe didn't leave on their accord, and even doing that same process worked for them as well. And because I value the personal aspects of everybody I've ever worked with, and I think that's extraordinarily important to show that. The way Comcast handled my departure. First of all, I'm the one who got to announce. I announced my departure on the Comcast blog, and I announced a bit about it. Then it was followed by a video that they did thanking me. And then we did a post explaining. I think I did two posts: one about my departure, then one about my team, where I talked about how I feel about the team, and they're continuing on. And that team's there till this day, and I love those guys. Love everybody there that I worked with. So they celebrated it that way. But then they also celebrated, there's a unique video, you can find it on ComcastVoices.com, where the video has a lot of people in the company just thanking me for being there and wishing me well, etc. And so it was a really neat video. I treasure it. And it certainly sent a really good message to anybody who saw it. And then they did blog posts after I left, make sure re-emphasizing who the team is, what they're doing, what they're up to, and so on. So we continued the process. It didn't just stop when I left, it continued. And it was a nice arch, and there's a good story there in how to handle someone leaving. So what I would recommend is two things. A, check out that story, but B, Google Charlene Lee and YouTube and my name. I think it comes up with that, where you can get it, where someone actually asked her this exact question, and I don't want to put the words out there because I'll never do it justice. She does a great job at answering that question. And Charlene Lee, if you don't know her, tremendous resource for everything related to this stuff.
All right, I've got another question. I'm going to throw a theoretical question at you and have you answer it. So imagine you're going into a company that has no social support today, and you've been hired as the strategist. How are you going in there, building a team? I'm really interested in team structure over time. How do you first start out, and then what does it look like in a year and 2 years, that sort of thing?
Sure. First thing I'm going to do when I get involved is listening. Deep listening, pulling in all the aspects. What is the conversation out there? What's that look like? Are our customers even talking? Do our customers even care? But I'm going to do a lot of that listening, and I'm going to bring that. That's the first thing I'm going to bring in. And show that. The approach that I like to take is first you go in with that, then obviously you want to get some effort or money towards that listening aspect too, so concentrating on that, and then building out, here's the needs of the community, because you now have this conversation, the dialogues that's going on. You share these things with senior leaders, they're going to want someone to address it as well. No one wants to see bad experiences just hanging. And so first start off with that. Then as you get that, you can then build on it, and you want to build it slow. You don't want to rush out and go, okay, we need 1,000 people. You'll never get it, and B, it's probably not the right thing to do from a business perspective. So we, at Comcast, we were planning on starting slow. In fact, we just started really slow. We started with myself and 2 people, Comcast Sherry and Comcast Mark, if you want to Twitter them. We started off doing it, and then we gradually expanded as we were doing this listening, as we were getting more in depth in these spaces, and then we were adding on based upon those needs. So you can always identify your needs. If you're doing community management, you can identify the needs because you can identify the activity. So start with that. Then, as I'm continuing forward, I will also get to the point where I even ask customers questions. Where do you want us to be, doing here? What do you want to do with your bank in social media? That's a question I like to ask a lot because it's important for me to understand those things. It's also important for the people I work for to understand those things. So I like to keep things grounded. I don't get overly excited about social media or jumping, or things, but I also don't want to be jaded by it either. I want to be somewhere in the middle. I want to be able to sit there and say, here's how things are moving forward and how I'm going to do it. And it's going to be methodical. And by doing that, I build trust in the organization, which means as you build that trust, gaining the extra resources becomes a lot easier. When people say, you know what, they're trying to do the right thing and they've always tried to do the right thing, do this. And then the other piece to it is once you're doing that listening, you're gaining that, making sure you're pushing those stories out, because then that gives you a lot of other help, because people start to then get the true ROI, which is you start measuring the process improvements you're doing, you start measuring the impact on the customer experience, all these things, policy changes, et cetera, they can be driven through this social listening. Every one of those has an ROI. Every piece of that time where you're listening and get information before your call center even has a clue that's going on, you can actually measure the ROI of that information, because now you can actually utilize that to actually deflect calls. And if you put messaging up and you get it where it's not, calls aren't going to that becomes ROI. But you have to start. First step is that deep listening, and that does not require big fancy tools. That does not require great expense. You could do that on an individual basis. I'm not big into always just jumping out to things like, do you have to have a forum? Some companies, the answer is yes. Other companies, no. It comes down to, our customers have enough passion where they want to hang out in your space, or they want to hang out in the space they're already in. Oftentimes, it's going to be in the space they're already in, so you need to be able to deal with that. So if your community is going to be okay, it's mainly going to be here on Facebook. Here's how we would have to manage that. So listen, 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 and when you think you're done listening, listen more.
Awesome. We have about 2 minutes left, so I've got a quick question. It's actually a yes or no question, but I think you might have more on it than that. So
you have a lot. I can just say yes or no?
We have a lot of social tools right now, and I'm wondering if social support, if customer support is better now than it was 10 years ago.
Customer service in general, we've added so many tools over the years. All the touch-tone stuff when you call and, all this other stuff. Yeah, think about it. We're more frustrated today than we ever were in trying to get a hold of someone to help. Why? It's not always about the tools. It's about the culture. It's about the people. It's about, are they able to do the right thing? And I think in service, what we've done over the years, we tried to make everything a process so we can outsource it. So we can ship it off, ship the job overseas, or ship the job somewhere else. And in the process of doing that, we've actually took away what service was really about, which is relationship building. And I think it's now time that we have to get back to building relationships in customer service. So, no, I think we're a lot far off than we need to be. But I think social media over the next few years is going to force that change in companies. And I'm very excited for that. And I'm very excited for those low-level service people who are very frustrated in their jobs today, because I think eventually they'll be the ones that can help lead that change.
It's an awesome way to end it, Frank. Thank you so much for sharing with us today. We're going to be, absolutely, we're going to get together again next Tuesday, everyone, for a discussion about community building and government with Kitty Woolley from the Department of Education and Tiffany Smith from the State Department. I'm announcing that Kitty Woolley is the top tweeter again today, but all of you folks out there that are tweeting, you will have a chance on Tuesday because she shouldn't be the top tweeter while she's presenting. So there will be no three-peat, Kitty. I want to thank everyone again, and we look forward to talking to you again on Tuesday. So have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks, Frank.